Good afternoon again. My name is Grace Araya, and I'm the Director of Community Systems Statewide Supports at Illinois Action for Children. And I'd like to welcome you to our week of webinars. If you've been with us all week, welcome back. And if you're new, welcome. We've partnered with Tamarack Institute to provide this week-long series of webinars to equip and support you in your community systems building efforts. This webinar series would not have been possible without the generous support of Illinois State Board of Education. I would like now to introduce you to Liz Weaver, who will be your trainer. Take it away, Liz.
Thanks so much, Grace, and hi, everybody. Welcome to the webinar. Really excited to be joining you again today. I joined you on Tuesday and am back here today. So I'd like to kick off the webinar with land acknowledgement. We begin this workshop by acknowledging that we are meeting on Indigenous land. As settlers, we're grateful for the opportunity to meet, and we thank all the generations of Indigenous peoples who have taken care of this land. As settlers, this recognition to the contributions and historic importance of Indigenous peoples must be clearly and overtly connected to our collective commitment to make the promise and the challenge of truth and reconciliation real in our communities. And I'd like to just acknowledge that I'm joining you from the city of Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. And my office is located on the traditional territories of the Erie, Neutral, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Mississaugas. This land is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant and the Between the Lakes Purchase. And I'd like to just now for a second turn us over to my colleague, Rute, who will tell us about how to utilize the technology of the Zoom platform. So over to you, Rute.
Thanks, Liz, and hi, everybody. Welcome to today's call. Just quickly, I just want to give a few notes about the technology. So firstly, the webinar will be recorded, and we'll send along any slides and resources and links that are shared today. You also notice the Q&A in the Q&A panel on your Zoom client. You can submit questions there, and you can also upvote questions you like discussed. And lastly, you can also use the Q&A panel and the chat function to ask any tech support questions if any issues arise for you throughout the call, and I'll be in the background to support. Thanks, Liz, and over to you.
Great, thanks so much, Rute. Really happy to have you on board. And so feel free to, if you run into any technical challenges, just send Rute a quick note in the chat box, and she'll respond really quickly to your questions or comments. So for those of you that are new to this webinar series or are just joining us for today, as Grace mentioned, it is co-hosted with the Tamarack Institute. Both Rute and I work for the Tamarack Institute. The Tamarack Institute has two parts to our work. One part is the part that I'm mostly involved with, called the Tamarack Learning Center. And we support change makers like yourselves in 5 ways. So around collective impact efforts, around community engagement, collaborative leadership, community innovation, and evaluating impact. And the week of webinars, actually, we're taking you around this circle. And today, the topic that we have really falls to the community innovation / community engagement areas along that circle. The other part of Tamarack's work is to work with communities across Canada, the United States, and elsewhere in what we call our vibrant communities practice areas. And so we have a Cities Reducing Poverty initiative where we work with more than 400 communities in Canada and the United States. We have a Deepening Community initiative, which is around neighborhoods and neighborhood revitalization. And we just launched a Communities Building Youth Futures initiative, which focuses on youth transitioning through high school to graduation and then into post-secondary education, training, or work world. So those are our 3 place-based practices that we have at Tamarack. As you know, this is a week of webinars. And so these are the other webinars in the week. So some of you may have joined us for the first 3 webinars, or were just with us for 1 or 2 of the other ones. Today, we're going to talk about facilitating co-design. And then tomorrow, you can still sign up for the final webinar, which is participatory approaches to evaluation, if you haven't signed up already. If you have signed up already, you'll get a notice about how to dial into the webinar. You'll get a reminder notice, or probably you already have received one for today, or you'll get it early tomorrow. So really happy to have you joining us. So we wanted to start today with something that was a little bit interactive to get you used to being in the chat box. And so we wondered about what superpower you wished you had right now. And in the pre-webinar chat that Rute and I had, we looked at this graph of all these superpowers, and I think we could figure out roughly 90% of them, not necessarily all of them. There were a couple of them that stumped us, but for sure, we knew about Captain America, and we know that Superman can leap tall buildings at a single bound, and Batman has the ability to have that kind of bat senses and do the crush pow things, and the Flash gets to run really quickly, and Wonder Woman has some awesome superpowers, and so does Spider-Man. So we invite you in the chat box to maybe identify what superpower you think would be useful to the work that you're doing, the work of community change, the work of trying to improve outcomes for children across Illinois. What superpower would be most related to that? So Rute, do we have anyone in the chat box putting in their superpowers?
I'm seeing Superwoman here coming up. Let's see. I wish I could. Some people want to fly. That's exciting. I also wish I could fly. We're seeing Wonder Woman come in too. Mind reading, nice. Captain America,
Oh, very cool.
And looking into the future. That's exciting. That's a good one.
Yeah, that might be a little bit of the Green Lantern. I don't know if that's a superpower. That I'm not as into Marvel comics, or so I'm not sure what the Green Lantern superpower is, but that would be a very cool superpower to be able to look into the future, particularly right now, because the world is so disruptive, right? And we really don't know what the future holds for us. All we know is that we're still going to be in this continual change.
Yeah.
Any other ones, Rute?
The last one that came in was solve the world's problems. That's definitely one that's useful and needed right now.
Yeah, I think we need all of the superheroes and their superpowers to be able to do that, right? Yeah, it is interesting. What's recently happened is that many of these superheroes come together in these movies, like the Avengers, or, they cluster together as or the Hulk and that kind of thing. So it is interesting that we could lever some of the superpowers in a cluster, collaborate together to solve all of the world's problems. So really great observation. Thanks, Rute.
Oh, no worries.
So today's webinar is going to follow this kind of format. We've done the introductions already. Thank you for participating in the superpower question. We're going to spend about 40 minutes or 35 to 40 minutes on the content. Throughout, we might pause, or you might come up with some questions. And so we'll pause at different times and bring forward your questions. So feel free to put them into the Q&A or to put them into the chat box. And then we do at the very end also have some time for questions and comments and observations. And we're going to ask you, as you're listening today, is there something that resonates with you, something that you might take forward into the work that you're doing, across Illinois to improve outcomes for children? And so that'll be our closing question at the very end. So today we're going to be really focusing on facilitating co-design, and there are 3 kind of objectives that we set out for the webinar. One is to kind of look at the intersection between community engagement, which is what we all do, and then weaving in the co-design process as part of the innovation, the community innovation perspective. We're going to learn how to maybe troubleshoot some of the tough engagement situations using the engagement spectrum. And then we're going to share with you some tools and some approaches to apply co-design in your work, and a little bit of the philosophy behind co-design as well. So hopefully that's what you're looking for, and hopefully it'll be helpful to the work that you're doing. So we really do think about innovation a lot, and particularly we look at the work that is happening in the sphere of social innovation, and then we think about, okay, how could we really take those social innovation practices and apply it to community, and really we think about them more as a community innovation approach. And so that's kind of our take at Tamarack on innovation. For those of you that joined the webinar on Tuesday, I give you a little bit of a taster about co-design, and we're going to go much deeper in this webinar around it. But co-design is the intersection between community engagement and community innovation. And community engagement is really about how do we engage a wide and diverse set of voices so that we can get to the root of the problem and develop even better practices at solving some of the complex problems that our communities are facing. And so how do we bring the right people together in constructive ways is really how we look at community engagement. And then our lens around innovation is really how do we draw on the knowledge, right? How do we pay attention to local knowledge, to local context, and so that we can create change in community that is relevant to the community context in which we're working. And we would know that, across the state of Illinois, things that might work in one community might work in another community, but that there would be nuances to it, right? And so, if you're in Chicago, you would be dealing with a certain set of things and a certain set of leaders and a certain ways of looking at the community. Then there might be a different set of leaders, a different set of nuances in another part of Illinois. So it's really important to think about what's the local context and how do we have to pay attention to the local context. And co-design is really the weaving of these two big ideas in a purposeful kind of way. So in terms of community engagement, I'm sure many of you are already familiar with the International Association of Public Participation community engagement spectrum. There are five pieces to the spectrum, or 5 points on the spectrum. Everything from informing folks about the change that might be happening to them in the community, all the way through to empowering folks in your community. And so every time we move along the spectrum, we have a different promise or a different kind of relationship with the people that we're trying to engage. And so when we're informing folks, we're trying to provide them with objective information. And really the essence is we're telling them, here's what's happening. But there isn't really a lot of that interaction or even co-design in that. As we start to think about involving, we're starting to lean more into the co-design sphere, which is really, here's a problem, what ideas do you have? Or even in collaborating and empowering, it's kind of like, how do we work together to solve the problem? So you can see that co-design really does sit most nicely in the areas of involving and collaborating with community partners. And so this spectrum we find very helpful at Tamarack, and we talk about it a lot, and it's kind of cool to see where co-design sits. The other that we layer on when we think about co-design is we think about the type of problem that the community is trying to solve. And there are different kinds of problems that we face in our communities. There are some simple problems, right? Which a good example of a simple problem is like baking a cake, right? Where you actually don't have to collaborate. You could collaborate amongst a small number of people, or you could even resolve that problem yourself. And so you lean into best practice. It's more about coordinating action. And you might have in place some standard operating procedures as a way of solving a simple problem. a complicated problem, or sometimes known as a technical problem, requires education and training. It really is about lifting up good practice. And the way that we often solve complicated or technical problems is that we sense what the problem is, we bring analysis to the problem, and then we respond. And so that's a kind of way of solving a technical problem. There's a third set of problems called complex problems, and a great example of a complex problem is raising children. So the approaches that you use to raise your first child might be different than the approaches you use for the second child, because each child has their own personalities, they have different peer groups that they relate to, they have different learning experiences in their lives. And so in complex problems, it's about emergent practice, right? So you go, okay, so here's this child. They're very good at these things. We're going to support them in this way, or here are some of their gaps. Here's my second child. They're very good at these things, or here are their gaps. And so this is how we're going to support them. And so the practice around complex problems is really probe, sense. First you say, okay, what's happening with this child right now? How are they feeling about that? So some of those sensing kind of things, and then responding, really thinking about, and often it's a act, react, and adapt kind of approach with complex problems. And then, more and more we're seeing in this world chaotic problems. And good examples of chaotic problems are the wildfires that happened in California and on the West Coast. And so in a case of a chaotic problem, you don't really have the time to probe and sense. Really what you need is a command and control kind of approach. So the way that you do it is you act, and then you sense, and then you respond. So it really is about the act to get people to safety, sense what other strategies you need to bring into place, and then respond to how the community is different as a result of that fairly traumatic event. And what's really important in terms of chaotic problems is thinking about what was the novel practice that emerged. And so, co-design also really wants you to think about what kind of problem is best suited to a co-design kind of process. And it could lean into the areas of complicated problems and complex problems. Those two are best suited for co-design, and actually the best fit of all is within the complex problem area. And then the other thing that's really interesting is to kind of think about the tools that sit within community innovation practice or social innovation practice that support co-design as a way of working and a way of being. And there's a whole raft of these tools out there. And if you just Google them, you'll find tons on the internet. But it's things like human-centered design and design thinking, participatory action research, which you're going to learn about a little bit more tomorrow, behavioral insight, scenario planning, evaluation, appreciative inquiry. All of those are within this broader sphere of innovation and social innovation, and they actually can help kind of help with that co-design practice. And they all really lean into the idea of, human-centered design and design thinking, which is really human-centered design. The easiest way of thinking about it is that you put the humans at the center, and then you design the processes and the purpose around the work that is really human-centered. So these are the principles that we use at Tamarack around co-design, but they're also principles that you would see out there with people who practice a lot of co-design. And in the case of Tamarack, what we think is really important, and the reason why we weave community engagement and social innovation or community innovation together, is that we think that, human-centered design, community really matters. So if we're trying to resolve the problems for community, community has to be centered. It has to be centered in the context of community, and that community matters. We also think that the notion that lived experience is integral. So for example, if you're trying to solve problems for children and their families across Illinois, you want to know what the lived experience of those children are and of their families. That has to be part of the conversation. And the best way to have a deep sense of knowing of those is by engaging, the parents of the children or engaging the children themselves. And so lived experience is really incredibly integral to this work, and really, deepening our collective understanding of that problem, that complex problem that we're trying to solve. That a shared vision can be really important to this work and really creates that kind of unifying purpose. And so if you think about the work that you're doing, with ACT, it is about this shared vision across the state of Illinois, but you might also have localized shared visions. And so to what degree can you unify, your network, the people that you're working with, your group around this kind of shared vision? That people are really creative, and that if we give people the appropriate tools and resources, they have a lot of creativity, and they're going to really rise to the occasion and give you their best ideas. And it's the combination of the ideas that really get us closer and closer to the solution. We also know, and our experience has been at Tamarack, that changes that are made with and by a community are more likely to succeed. So if you think about the engagement spectrum, the community engagement spectrum, the more we can get into, the higher end of the spectrum, the more those solutions will succeed. And we see real examples of that all the time in our work, right? The things that we build together are the things that are much more likely to succeed. And then finally, when we work collaboratively, no single organization or single individual is at risk. And in fact, what we do is we share and distribute the risk. And we also benefit from the knowledge, the wisdom of the crowd, as they often say. So those are kind of cool things to think about in terms of the key design principles for co-design. So for those of you that were on the call on Tuesday, you already saw this double diamond process. It is really a co-design process, and it's a opportunity to have a number of different conversations in a way that diverges out, converges in, diverges out, and converges in. So it enables us to kind of ask questions, come back together, make some decisions, move out into questions again or conversations, and then come back together. While we show it as 2 diamonds, you actually, in some cases, might have to add a couple more diamonds because your conversation hasn't completely finished, or you might want to come back to a conversation in one part of the diamond that hasn't necessarily been completed. So there's different ways that you can implement the double diamond process. So the really simple rules behind this are that you want to practice questions, right? You want to practice inquiry. So for example, if someone says something that you might disagree with, rather than say, I disagree with you, you might ask them, tell me a little bit more about that. Could you explain that in a little bit more detail? So, or you might form that first kind of divergence process as a set of questions. We talked about this the other day in the webinars. Could we practice inquiry much more intentionally in this process? It's about thinking big, synthesizing, thinking big, synthesizing. It is really about not jumping to solutions too quickly. And so often in our collaborative work, we want to get to the answer really quickly. And sometimes when we jump to the answer too quickly, we miss out on some really kind of innovative ideas, maybe some of the stuff that's in our own blind spot that we miss. So this kind of opportunity to co-dialogue, co-practice inquiry, all of these kind of things really allow us to really explore what might be the realm of possible before we dive into what the solution might be. And really, you want to use this opportunity to think about differences, right? And listen for them. And don't let differences be something that polarizes us, but rather begin to ask questions about those differences. What do you see? If you made the statement and I don't agree with it, what is it about your experience that makes that alive for you, right? And what is it about my experience that makes that a difference for me? And so then it might be that the differences are, there are things in both differences that actually can be a synergy or can be a point for moving forward. So really interesting to think about, okay, how do we go into these conversations with much more intentionality? And if I was doing co-design work, I would put these up as almost the principles or the simple rules for the co-design kind of practice. So you can take that forward. So we want you in the chat box to really think about the 4 elements of the double diamond approach and think about what do you maybe skim over quickly, and what scenario or what issues are you working on right now where you think, hey, it might be good to take this co-design, at least as much as I know about it right now, and apply it to that thing that we're maybe struggling with around our collaborative planning table or in our workplace. And what do you think that this might allow? So we'll give you a couple of minutes to put some stuff into the chat box, and Rute, I'll come back to you in a minute or so to see what appears in the chat box, but we'll go to the next item and then we'll circle back to these questions. So the first part of the co-design process is this idea of sharing diverse voices. And so this is what we've done is we've taken the co-design and we've said, okay, so if we wanted to bring in lots of people into a conversation about something to shift something in our community, how could we apply co-design into sharing or engaging diverse voices in this work? And so that's really the first element that we are applying the co-design process to. And we'll kind of walk you through an example here. And so the first divergence is how do we effectively engage different perspectives into the conversation about the change that we want to see in our community, whether it's around things like place-based poverty reduction or communities building youth futures. And so this is how we apply this process at Tamarack. Some of the things that we think about in terms of the first kind of divergent conversation, and the reason why it's important to kind of bring in different voices, is that it will allow us to get close to the people who are being impacted by the problem that we're trying to resolve or to solve together. And it'll also help us understand their particular needs as we seek to influence the broader systems change, right? So having different voices helps us kind of understand what it's like from, let's say, government's perspective, what it's like from an educator's perspective, what it's like from a person with the lived experience perspective. And once we begin to understand the nuances of that issue and how they're engaged or not, we can then begin to think about what are the patterns that have emerged and how do we, how do we overcome, how do we start to kind of converge together and decide what we're going to work on together. The engaging diverse voices also is about building trust and empathy for the thing that we want to do together. It's about letting things emerge and to see where the patterns are, as I said. It involves people, it involves our key stakeholders, and it really does build this kind of collaborative culture. So that's the first part of the double diamond. As we move into the second part, we begin to see that there are things that could be really beneficial, right? So we know that there are benefits to the organizations that are involved in engaging the diverse voices in the conversation, and there are benefits to the community. In the second part of the double diamond, I'll come back. I'm just going to circle one step forward. In the second part, it's really then taking these different voices and then building a common vision together. So With the diverse voices, here are two tools you can use to engage people. So you can brainstorm names and then think about who are the people that we want to involve in this conversation. Or you can ask the community who would they like to have involved in this conversation. So the community reference system is a way of, both of these tools are ways of understanding, if we're going to engage diverse voices and we want to really be intentional about who to involve, these are two great tools around who to involve. So Rute, I'm going to take us back to that question that I posed before we went into the first half of the double diamond. What were some of the responses that we heard in the chat box?
I think people are still thinking through their responses. Maybe we can go back to the question just in case they missed.
Oh, sure. Yeah, let's go back really quickly. So, which part do you tend to skim over? So do you skim over the engaging of diverse voices? Maybe I'll bring this picture up. The sharing of perspectives, the forming of a common vision, the building of new ideas, or the deciding of a path forward. Which one do you move through really quickly? Just in a kind of a perspective of just getting it done, or which is an area where you think, wow, this area would be really helpful to us to spend a bit more time in thinking about one of these areas.
Someone here says that they think the third phase is skipped over a lot, and another one is forming a common vision.
Yeah. That's so number 2 and number 3, I think you're right about that. I think, so often around some collaborative tables that I've been involved in the past, we share our perspectives, but sometimes the vision is driven by a single organization. And so it's less of a shared vision or a common vision and more the vision of an organization moving it forward. Yeah, and I can also see the building of new ideas, because if a single organization or a small group of people are holding that vision, then the building of new ideas is even less engaging, right? Because it's really driven by that person or that organization's vision. And so, you tend to not be able to really bring in the wealth and the wisdom of the larger community. Anything else, Rute?
Yeah, we're seeing a couple around deciding on a path forward. So that's one of the ones that people agree that is skipped over.
Yeah, it's interesting. I use a tool a lot called, it comes from the Liberating Structures website, liberatingstructures.org, which is called the 15% solution. And so we might decide on a path forward, but then again, it's driven by a single organization or a single individual. And so the 15% solution is, how can we all contribute? And it allows people, or it welcomes people to identify what they're already doing in their organizations and how what they're already doing can contribute to this shared path forward, as opposed to a single path forward, right? And I think, lots of times people around collaborative tables will say, yeah, they're kind of buying in, but I'm not sure they're owning it. And that's the difference between buy-in and ownership, the way that we can intentionally engage people. So interesting, right? So we're good at the sharing of perspectives, but the other parts of the double diamond process might be a little bit more challenging to all of us.
There's actually a last comment around that first part of the process that says it can be difficult to reach diverse stakeholders.
Yeah, it absolutely can. And it is interesting because the two tools, and maybe I'll jump ahead again to those two tools that we provided. These two tools are a way of kind of trying to brainstorm who we need to engage in this process, what are the voices, and then to really ask people around our table, how are you connected to these diverse perspectives that we want to have around the conversation that we want to have. And sometimes we're really good at connecting to the people that we already know in the sectors that we're already working in. But let's say we really want to do something around engaging youth to employment opportunities, and we're not very good at connecting to employers, right? And so then we've got to build our muscle around that, around how do we connect to employers? Who are the employers that we know around this table? Who are the employers that are already engaging youth? And then how do we connect to them? And so the reference system, the community reference system as a tool, is a really great tool for that, because you can go to some employers and you can say, hey, have a question. We're really working on youth employment in our community. Who are the employers that you might suggest? And you might go to some people that you know first, and they might suggest 3 other people. And then when you want to engage them, you could say to the folks that appear regularly on your list, hey, your name was mentioned by about 10 people that we've already talked to. So it's a really nice way of kind of connecting in and engaging people. So these are 2 great tools for engaging diverse voices. And as we go through each point of the double diamond, I'll give you some additional tools so that we're not just leaving you hanging, we're giving you some tools. So the second part of the double diamond, of the first double diamond, is the forming of a common vision. And so this is where you're converging. So you've got lots of different ideas and lots of different perspectives, but now you want to kind of bring together those perspectives and try to figure out, okay, so how are we going to work together more effectively? And so it's really about moving along this continuum, right? From the shared question to then thinking about, are there some criteria that we might sort through all these ideas that we have that have been generated as we've diverged out, to then thinking about what could that vision look like. And then the second diamond is really about the kind of development of the plan. So it's kind of thinking about it in these 4 stages. Some things to consider when you're really focusing on building the common vision is, what's the context? What's our local context, right? What are the things that we have to pay attention to that are important to the community that we're trying to support? And what are the nuances about that? Has there been a major shift? Has there been a major election change that we have to pay attention to? Is there a major leadership change or a number of leadership changes? Is the timing right for this kind of initiative? What does the data tell us about this problem that we're trying to resolve? And how do we use data in a way that helps us become more evidence informed? What would be helpful? What kind of output would be helpful in this case? How could we frame this as an aspiration? So these are just some things to consider in terms of coming to a little bit of synthesis or synergy in the forming of the common vision. So here are a couple of tools that you can use to help you form a common vision. Ones that we like a lot at Tamarack. Some might be appreciative interviews, right? One tool might be appreciative interviews, where you want to say, okay, so what would make this thing that we want to work on successful? And so you frame interviews with key stakeholders around it. You might draw a picture together. So let's say we want to work on better outcomes for children and youth in our community. What visually would that look like? So drawing together often illustrates some of the things that people feel are most important to them, right? So coming up with a visual or a picture really does that. Using a common agenda planning canvas, and there's a link to one of those planning canvases. And this is a way of not only taking people through different kind of areas where they can focus in on conversation, but it also looks at what are the assumptions that we have about this issue, and then what are some of the strategies that we might want to move forward. Developing a plan on a page is really synthesizing and saying in a way that allows you to share it with other stakeholders. And once you get a plan on a page in place, you might take it out to some of the people that were involved, or maybe some of your external partners, and say, hey, does this make sense? Is this roughly right? And it's a great tool for building consensus and momentum. journey walking and or journey mapping and data walking are two other tools. And then you can spend time co-defining your dilemma. And we're going to show you this rather than give you a link to this tool. We're going to actually show you it in practice as a way of getting towards a common vision. And this is, you know, going into that synthesis part of the double diamond process. So you want to, in co-defining the dilemma, you want to think about the design question first, right? So what is the design question that you want to probe? Who are the stakeholders that are involved? What is their position around that question, and what might their interests be in terms of, and so kind of synthesizing a path forward, or kind of thinking about, okay, what might we do? The co-defining the dilemma approach can help you think about, okay, so our educators might think this way, our parents might think this way, our, you know, those of us that are working in NGOs supporting this work might think this way, business community might think this way. Here are their positions on this problem, this design question, this dilemma we're trying to resolve, and here's the interest. So here's an example of the co-defining the dilemma design. So in this case, the dilemma to be resolved is one that comes from Australia. And it's about the context where the sea levels are rising for a lot of communities that border. If you know anything about Australia, most of the major centers are around the perimeter of Australia. And so with rising sea levels, places like Sydney and Melbourne and some of their major capital cities are going to be at risk in a very short period of time. And so the dilemma is, how do we adapt to sea level rise, manage risk, and provide certainty for all, knowing that the solutions may be costly and have a wide range of impacts on our lives and our places? So you can see how that is a very complex problem, right? So there's the complex problem of the environmental impacts, there's the complex problem of the costs that will be involved in it, and there's the complex problems that people will be impacted by this. And so there will both be people that will be willing to move forward quickly, but then there will be people in there that'll say, hey, no, I bought this property, it's right on the ocean, it's really about my quality of life, and I am unwilling to move despite what everybody tells me about rising sea levels, right? And so it's very complex. It's really about probing, sensing, that kind of way that we deal with the complexity. And so what they did, and what Max Hardy facilitated in this work, is they kind of looked at it from the perspectives of the planning staff at council, the elected officials known as the councillors, the coastal homeowners, the climate action proponents, and the property developers. And you can see at the second ring in their positions around this issue, what was important to them about the issue, and what question had to be resolved to make that, to create this kind of common ground, or at least ground where they could have a conversation. So it's a really great tool, this co-defining the dilemma tool. You put your question in the middle, you think about the key stakeholders, and then you start to build out what you think their different interests are and their perspectives are. And in some cases, you could invite them around the table to share with you themselves their interests and their perspectives, and also what questions they would need to answer. So kind of interesting, a great little tool for this work. I'm going to go through the next two stages relatively quickly, because I know we're coming to the end of the webinar. So the next stage, so we've kind of defined that problem, we know the interests and the perspectives. That actually led us to some new questions, some new problems. So now we've got to build ideas around those new questions and those new problems, and then we've got to converge again around a path forward. So you can't go from sharing perspectives to deciding the path forward, because you're going to miss all this wonderful stuff in the middle. So when you're building new ideas, you want to not look at too much at the negative, but you really want to focus on what's possible, where some of the bright spots are. Don't totally dismiss the barriers, but you also want to focus on what is possible. And also don't always feel the need to create new. It's really about, what do we already have in place that might be able to come to. So these are things that you might have conversations around in that second diverging process. And in deciding the path forward, you want to kind of think about, there are lots of ideas. What are ones that are possible for us to implement? And what's the time frame that we're going to work on to implement? So you might say we have all these good ideas, but really within the next year, this is what is possible for our path forward. And we're going to try this thing, and then we might come back to the beginning of the double diamond process and go our way through them as well. You also want to gauge how much energy there is around each of the ideas. Some ideas will have a lot of energy, and other ideas might not necessarily have as much buy-in or as much energy to move the idea forward. So now, before we go to your questions, we invite you one more time to put an idea into the chat box about, what resonated with you in this co-design process, and how might you build some of it into your collaborative practice. So we'll give you some time to do that. In the interim, Rute, are there any questions that anyone has put into the chat box?
I haven't gotten any questions yet, but I did have a question, if I may, around the double diamond process. So thinking about engaging people with lived experience or engaging the community in general, some organizations might be eager to, engage the community or engage people with lived experience, but the community isn't necessarily eager to, engage with the organization. So how do they find that balance within this co-design process?
Yeah, so it might be that with some communities there is a lower level of trust, right? So and so that might be a barrier to engagement of those community members. And so you might have to think about, what do we need to do first to build some of that trust? And how do we let them know about the kind of process we're going to go through, and to really show to them that, the intention of this is really to co-design together, right? So, trust is often, there's a barrier or a lack of trust when people feel like it's done to them as opposed to done with them. And so there might be some work that we have to do first to build trust with the community, and to go slow in the process, right? And to really pay attention to what they're saying. In some cases, we might only do the first part, the first diamond, and then come up with something that we could do together coming out of the converging part of the process, and actually make progress around something very small. There's a really good example I'll share with. So there's a community in Hamilton where it was supported housing, right? The city had a number of supported housing. And in that small part of a neighborhood, there were a number of houses. It was like a little bit of a development. And the houses had two different colored doors. There were the red doors of the people in that neighborhood who had jobs and went to work. They were low income, but they had jobs. And then there were the green doors, right? And the green doors were people who were on social assistance. And they lived in separate parts of this small cluster of this community. And so that created a lot of angst and a lot of tension in that community. And so they went in and they asked the community members, what could we do better in this community that could lead to better outcomes? And the first thing that the community said was, like, there are red doors and green doors, and these are very stigmatizing. So rather than take on something big, what they did was they painted all the doors, right? And they actually began to intermingle the community in a much more intentional way when opportunities evolved. And so sometimes to build trust, you have to take on micro activities in a way that continues to build trust, right? And so you might not go through the big complex, but you can still use the double diamond process. And then when you're converging into something, to resolve that and then build trust and then come back out and use the process again.
Yeah, thanks, Liz. Because sometimes as organizations, you kind of view problems differently than the community. When you can start small rather than trying to solve a big issue, it's just better to start at the community level.
Yeah, and I think it's particularly important if one of the contexts of the folks that you're working with where there's a high degree of mistrust or a lack of trust, right? You really want to think about that's why situating what you're trying to do in the local context is so critical as part of this process. And really trying to get an understanding of that. And so it might be that even in the first conversation that you have is what in the local context do we have to pay attention to, or what in this neighborhood is important to you that we have to pay attention to as we go into this process. So any comments or questions that have appeared in the chat box about either how this co-design process might work or any reflections that folks have? Rute.
Sure. There's a question here from Monique. She's asking, how is explanatory synthesizing in common visions and new shift within the community important to remaining, keeping active and effective engagement?
Yeah, so that's a great question, Monique. Thank you for that. I think that it depends on how you determine what you're going to do as your initial path forward, right? And so, when the group has decided, okay, we're going to do X, Y, Z, what you probably want to do then is say, okay, so what does success look like for us? So that might be the second conversation, the second part of the divergent conversation. What would success look like for us? And then what could you contribute to this success? Might be a couple of questions so they're co-generating the ideas behind success. And then they're also kind of saying what they could do, which is gives us an idea of, okay, so what are the next steps that we take, right? A couple of years ago, a year ago, I worked with a group that was working on bringing the conversation around adverse childhood experiences across the province of Ontario. And they wanted to host, 6 community conversations in different parts of the province. Ontario is a pretty big province. And so I asked them what success looked like for them in that case, right? We did a bit of a second part of the double diamond, and they said, oh, we want 6 conversations. And I said, so how many people? And we kept on asking a number of questions around those 6 conversations. How many partnerships, how many people, what did you hope to accomplish through those 6 conversations, that kind of thing. And it was really interesting because what success looked like from their perspective actually led them into organizing a whole bunch of conversations with some really deep outcomes. So in the end, they actually had 8 conversations, 7 in person and 1 virtual. They were able to start in 3 community roundtables around adverse childhood experiences. They were able to build strong partnerships across the 6 communities. So they were able to, through the what does success look like, it actually led to their kind of what their path forward was going to be, and then led to their outcomes. So again, it's a really great way of building energy and intentionality on that second diamond. How we doing, Rute?
Thanks, Liz. There were a few questions around some of the resources you had shared. So I'm just going to make a note that we're going to share those with you all in the post follow-up webinar. So don't worry, you didn't miss anything. We'll send those along.
Yeah, and just building on that, Rute, Tamarack is very tools oriented, right? And so we love to put together tools, and we love to watch how communities utilize the tools. And so please feel free to poke around our website and to R&D, rip off and duplicate. So we invite you to take the tools and use them in your own context and prototype them. let us know how they worked for you, or if there are any changes you think we should put into the tools, because we're always upgrading them and changing them. And we also have great case studies and webinars and things like that. So please feel free to R&D our website.
Yeah. Thanks, Liz. And I'm noticing there are no more questions coming in. So am I okay to just wrap up with the final announcements?
Yeah, I think I have no, we were going to questions. Yeah, so it's up to you, Rute. Back to you for final announcements.
Thanks, Liz, and thanks everyone for joining us today. Just a quick note, the last webinar in the series will be taking place tomorrow, and that's going to be on evaluation. So please check that out. I'll put the link in the chat box now. As well, once you hop off the webinar, it's going to direct you to a survey. Could you please fill that out? We love to hear from you and get your feedback so we can improve these webinars to make them better for other learners. So please put your feedback for us to get more information, and definitely reach out to me, Rute at tamarackcommunity.ca, or Duncan at tamarack.community.ca if you have any comments or any questions about today's webinar. And thank you so much, Liz, for your presentation. It was very insightful. And thanks everyone for your comments and participating in some of the activities today.
Yeah, thanks everybody. And it was really great to spend this hour with you. And hopefully you'll practice some of the tools and some of the resources and go into the process. It's a really fun process to work with your collaborative groups or work in your workplace. So thanks everybody.
Thanks everyone.